Have you ever visited your parents, on time, with everything prepared, yet felt the distance between you stretch wider than ever? Lucas, a tech millionaire, brought flowers to the nursing home every Sunday, visiting his mother without fail. But he never stayed longer than 30 minutes. Not once. Until one morning, when Esther, quiet and weary, murmured, "Don't bring flowers anymore. I'd rather hold your hand." From that moment on, everything Lucas had believed about being a dutiful son began to unravel, gently, imperceptibly, and so began a journey of return. Not to his mother, but to himself. Today's story might be the whisper you've been waiting for all along. Sunday morning. The parking lot outside Riverview Nursing Home was as still as always. A sleek, black Lexus glided in, the engine barely making a sound. Inside the car, a man adjusted the collar of his pale blue shirt, smoothed down a muted tie, and reached for a bouquet of red tulips. Lucas Bellamy, 46, CEO, founder of a biotech firm, and, according to the world, a model son. He glanced at his watch. 8:59, 1 minute early. He stepped out, polished, precise, as if heading into a board meeting, not a room where his mother was spending the last stretch of her life. The first floor still held the faint scent of lavender oil. The receptionist smiled and bowed her head, slightly. Lucas returned a courteous nod, polite, composed, the way good men are taught to be. Nothing in excess, nothing missing. He didn't linger. Up the stairs to the second floor. Room 212, Esther Bellamy's room. Once a literature teacher, a woman of formidable strength and fierce maternal love. When Lucas opened the door, a soft light from the window spread across her face. She was sitting in an armchair by the window, holding an old book, but her eyes had long drifted away from the page. They were still beautiful, though clouded now, and fixed on the hallway beyond, as if waiting for something. Or someone. "Morning, Mom. Beautiful day again." Lucas's voice was calm, measured, as always. He placed the tulips on the table and took the leather chair across from her, the one he had chosen himself 3 years ago when she first moved in. "It'll be just as comfortable as your old teacher's chair," he'd told her then. "Your favorite flowers, right? Like when you taught at the high school," he added, as if filling the space with something safe and predictable. Esther looked at him. Her eyes warmed for a moment, then shifted away, back toward the hallway. Her hand tightened slightly around the book. Lucas pulled his phone from his pocket and checked his messages. A brief furrow crossed his brow as he scrolled. Through his calendar, he glanced at her again, just in time to see her close the book. "You doing okay this week?" he asked, still looking at the screen. "I still wait for Sundays," she said, her voice even. The words made him look up. He slipped the phone back into his pocket. A thin silence passed between them. "I always come on time, don't I?" Esther didn't respond. Her gaze drifted to the tulips, then a sigh, barely audible, escaped her lips. She spoke as if to no one at all. "On time doesn't mean you're really here." Lucas frowned. He said nothing. An old memory flickered through his mind. One night, long ago, when he was 8. He had woken from a nightmare, trembling under the covers. His mother had sat by his bed holding his hand, reciting a poem, a verse he once loved and had long forgotten. "Don't bring flowers. I'd rather hold your hand." The memory was gone as quickly as it came. Lucas gave a small shake of the head, brushing away the weight in his chest. "Do you need anything? Is anyone bothering you?" he asked, steering the conversation back to safer ground. "No one bothers me, but no one really asks how I am either." Lucas looked at his watch. 9:28. "I have to go. Meeting with the Japanese investors. I'll see you next week, okay? Take care, Mom." He leaned in and kissed her cheek. Cold, like the space between them, growing wider with every passing week. He stepped out and gently closed the door behind him. The hallway stretched straight and silent. His footsteps echoed, steady, unhurried. He left as he had over 100 times in the last 3 years. Inside, Esther remained in her chair, eyes on the door. Her hand reached out, touching the tulips. One petal fell to the floor. Outside, in the garden, Mila, the morning nurse, walked past the glass corridor. She saw Lucas heading to his car. She said nothing, just bent down quietly and picked up the fallen tulip petal near the stone bench. In the car, Lucas started the engine. His reflection in the rearview mirror looked calm, as always. Except this time. His hand lingered on the wheel longer than usual. The car pulled away. On time, as scheduled, but the words still echoed in his mind. On time. Doesn't mean you're really here. The door to room 212 had closed barely 2 minutes ago. The faint trace of cologne still lingered in the air, a soft echo of Lucas's carefully pressed shirt. In the hallway, his footsteps had already faded, leaving behind only the slow, steady rotation of the ceiling fan, stretching the silence just a little longer. Inside, Esther sat motionless, her gaze fixed on the door, as if still watching the space where her son had just vanished. Beside her chair, the bouquet of red tulips Lucas had brought lay vivid and beautiful, yet oddly out of place. One petal had fallen, resting askew beneath the chair. It was the first thing Mila Parker noticed as she stepped inside. 38, the morning shift nurse, tidy frame, hair pulled low, eyes patient and quietly worn. She bent down to pick up the petal, then glanced at the bouquet, its blooms beginning to tilt and sag. "Sunday already?" Esther asked, her voice raspy but clear. Mila's presence seemed to shift the air, slower, warmer, free from schedules and small talk. "Yes, just past 9:30. Mila answered softly, placing a fresh water pitcher on the table and replacing the old tea. Esther nodded slowly. Her eyes no longer searched the door. They rested on Mila, the only one here who didn't pass her by, but stayed. "He came earlier today. Probably had another meeting," she said, resting a hand on the old leather journal in her lap. Mila didn't reply. She gathered the wilted petals from the table. As her fingers brushed the bouquet, Esther gently shook her head. "Don't throw them away. Even when they fade, I keep them. Like habits. Like old love." A pause. "Lucas is a good man. Kind, successful, but there's something he left behind somewhere. I don't know what it is. Only that, every time he walks out that door, I find myself still sitting here, not waiting for the next visit, but hoping that one day, just once, he'll look me in the eye and ask, 'Are you lonely?'" Mila froze mid-motion. She had heard Esther say this before, in different shades, but this time, it wasn't a lament. It was longing. She quietly took the chair opposite. Didn't ask anything, didn't offer comfort, just listened. Sometimes, silence is the only thing that lets another person speak their truth. "My mother loved wild daisies," Mila said after a while. Not because they were pretty, but because they survived. Wind, neglect, didn't matter. One year, I missed her birthday, too busy with exams. She only said, "It's okay you didn't come, but you could have asked if I was tired." She paused, smiled faintly. And I didn't ask. Esther looked at her, her aged eyes full of something tender and deep. Perhaps, for the first time, she saw a daughter not born of her, but someone who had touched the same scar she had been carrying for 3 years. Mila stood and poured another cup of peppermint orange tea, the kind Esther liked. As she set it down, she noticed a slip of paper peeking from the edge of Esther's journal. She didn't open it, just smoothed the crease gently. "Once I wrote a poem," Esther said, her fingers brushing the page. "Don't bring flowers, I'd rather hold your hand." He said it was a little cheesy. But I wasn't upset, I just tucked it away, somewhere between the Sundays. Mila looked down at the bouquet. It was beautiful, but it looked alone. Before leaving, she pulled out her small notebook, not for medical notes, but to remember. Esther, 212. Sunday, red tulips. One fallen petal, and a question never asked. She closed the notebook and stepped into the hallway where the late afternoon light had begun to slip in from the far end. Behind her, another petal dropped, quiet as a breath unspoken. Some questions don't need answers, they only need to be asked. Afternoon sunlight slanted through the window, casting long streaks of gold across the floor of room 212. A breeze stirred the thin curtain, making it flutter like the breath of time itself. Inside, Esther sat motionless, one hand resting lightly on an old leather notebook, its edges worn, its pages yellowed with age. When Mila returned after the afternoon round of injections, she found her still in the same position, but there was something in her eyes, an inward gaze, as if she were searching for something long buried. "What are you looking for?" Mila asked gently, approaching as if afraid to disrupt the current of memory moving quietly through the older woman. "A poem. I wrote it decades ago." "Back when I was still teaching," Esther murmured, her wrinkled fingers turning each page with deliberate care. Her voice was low, but it held clarity, not the wavering of forgetfulness, but the quiet urgency of someone searching for a key to something much deeper. There was a goose, a sheet of paper, purple ink smudging everywhere, she said, half to herself, half to the past. Mila didn't interrupt. She simply sat beside her, peering over the notebook the way one might share an old memory on an autumn afternoon. At last, Esther stopped on a page stained with ink, but the handwriting still legible. Her dim eyes brightened ever so slightly, and then, in a voice soft as summer rain on a rusted rooftop, she began to recite. "Once, I wrote the first line in purple ink, my students laughed. 'Your poems live in the clouds, miss?' I laughed. With them, hiding my reddened eyes, each line a day I never finished writing." Mila said nothing. In that moment, the walls of the nursing home seemed to dissolve, and they were no longer two women in a quiet room, but teacher and listener in a classroom 35 years gone. Esther was young again, her soft curls tucked. Behind her ears, crisp white shirt tucked into a high-waisted skirt, standing at the chalkboard in a sunlit room. On the board, the same poem, slanted and neat in white chalk. At the front, a 10-year-old boy sat hunched over his notebook, doodling. On the margins, untouched by his mother's silly poems. "Lucas, are you listening?" came her voice, not stern, just curious. The boy looked up, confused. "Something about clouds and ink," he guessed. The class laughed. She laughed too. But when she turned back to the board, her hand trembled slightly, and her eyes were rimmed with quiet red. And just like that, the memory dissolved. Like foam caught in wind, it left behind only the stillness of the present. Strangely full. Not sad, not sweet, just full. "That boy," Esther whispered, her lips drawing tight. "He said poetry was silly, said I was sentimental, but once I saw him tuck a piece of my writing into his pencil box. Never admitted it." Mila looked at her, something unnamed blooming in her chest. The ache of a child who once brushed past something fragile and beautiful, too afraid to pause. "Maybe he didn't know how to say it," she murmured. "But that doesn't mean he didn't feel it." Esther didn't answer. She turned a few more pages. A black and white photograph slipped out of a young woman cradling a newborn, smiling with the warmth of early summer, scrawled beneath in faded ink. "Lucas, 2 weeks old, the day I wrote my first poem for him." Her hand reached for the photo, trembling. Her eyes shone, but no tears fell. Only her lips moved, almost imperceptibly. "I wrote so much, but I never had the words, not for what it felt like to hold him that first time." Mila said nothing. She pulled a small notepad from her pocket and scribbled down a few lines, not to document, but to preserve something slipping away day by day. Page 37. Purple ink poem photo. Lucas as newborn, tilted handwriting, love still whole. Before she left, Mila gently closed the notebook, tucking the photo inside, as if to keep that memory from slipping loose ever again. Esther closed her eyes, but her lips kept moving, murmuring the lines softly to herself, like a teacher reciting her own lesson, not for anyone else to hear, only to remind herself she still remembered, she still wrote. Every Sunday, Riverview Nursing Home moved to a rhythm of its own, slower, softer, and somehow lonelier. The halls remained spotless, the light gentle, but the footsteps of visiting relatives carried a strange mix of fatigue and effort. Effort to prove they still existed in some fragile corner of someone's memory. At precisely 9 ECO, Lucas Bellamy entered the lobby, as he always did. But something about the way he moved today had shifted. His stride slowed as he neared the elevator, and for the first time in 3 years, he looked, not at his phone, but at the old clock on the second floor. It wasn't ticking. "Good morning, Mr. Bellamy," the receptionist greeted. This time he didn't return the usual polite nod. Just a faint lift of his lips, a small, distracted gesture easy to miss. He wasn't carrying the usual bold bouquet. Today, the tulips were white. No wrapping, no ribbon. He hadn't thought it through. He just didn't want color to overpower the quiet in the room. The door to room 212 creaked softly as he entered. Esther was in her chair, as always, but today she wasn't gazing out the window. She was looking straight at him, waiting clearly, and perhaps hoping. "Hi, Mom." His voice was lower than usual. She didn't respond right away. Her eyes went to the flowers, then to him. Long, steady. Lucas hesitated. "You changed the flowers," she said at last, a rare, small smile on her lips. "Thought, maybe you'd like something gentler than red tulips," he replied, placing them in the vase. His hand trembled slightly as he poured water. Mila, watching from outside the window, noticed, but she didn't enter. The room was still, like a lake before rain. Even the broken wall clock stayed quiet, as if time here no longer needed to move. "Have a question," Esther said after a pause. Lucas looked up. "Ask me anything." She didn't meet his eyes. Instead, she stared at her own hands, wrinkled, fragile, the same hands that had copied thousands of lines of poetry, taught generations to write, comforted a child once terrified of storms. "You like holding my hand?" He froze. His hand rested on the door handle, reflexively. His gaze met hers. There were no tears in her eyes, no reproach, just something small, a wish to be his mother, not by title but by feeling. He didn't answer. He didn't know how. Every polite response, "Of course, I love you," suddenly felt hollow. Esther spoke again, gently, as if afraid she had pushed him too far. "You don't have to answer now. I've just wondered, all these years, I can't remember what your hand feels like." Lucas took a breath. He sat down, but didn't reach out. His hands rested on his knees, fingers twitching slightly, like a boy trying to recall a lesson he never really learned. "I sit here," Esther said, turning to the window, "and I watch the garden. Other families come, children, grandchildren. They hug, they hold hands, they talk too loud. But you and I," she smiled faintly, "we always feel like we're in a meeting." Lucas let out a quiet laugh. Not bitter, just soft. He looked at her. "You really want to hold my hand?" "No," she said. "I want to know if you want to." For the first time, the question wasn't about action. It was about desire. Lucas stared at his hands, fingers that had signed deals, typed through the night, led meetings, negotiated, controlled, but never once stopped long enough to feel what they were touching. His gaze shifted to her hands, thin, papery skin, veined blue. These hands had written poems, cooked countless meals, led him safely across busy streets. He remembered a day when he was 5, fell off his bike, scraped both knees. She walked him home, holding his hand the whole 3 miles, just so he wouldn't feel left behind. He reached out, slowly, but with certainty. She didn't say a word. Her hand met his, light as old silk, and squeezed. Lucas didn't cry, but something shifted inside him, like a room opening. When he stood to leave, his hand touched the doorknob, not unconsciously this time. He paused there, holding it for a long moment as if the brass held memory. Behind him, Esther watched. She said nothing. She didn't smile, but there was a light in her eyes that hadn't been there in 3 years. Lucas stepped into the hallway. The noon sunlight trailed behind him, gold on the floor. Outside, Mila stood by the glass corridor, notebook in hand. She had written a single new line. For the first time, he hesitated at the door, and somewhere inside the man walking away, a quiet thought stirred. For the first time, I'm not sure I want to leave. If you've ever walked out of a room but felt something inside you hadn't left, do you remember what made you want to turn back? Lucas Bellamy didn't leave the nursing home with a head full of meetings, deadlines, or follow-ups like he usually did. This time, he drove slower than usual. No GPS, no calls to his assistant, just silence, and the echo of his mother's poem threading through his mind, each word like a knock on the locked door of memory. "Don't bring flowers. I'd rather hold your hand." It wasn't just a line of poetry. It was something that had never been spoken aloud, a question never asked, and the reason he'd never once turned back after walking out of her room. When he got home, he didn't go to his office. Instead, he stood before the bookshelf, eyes drawn to an old photograph. His mother, young and beaming, chalk in hand at the front of a classroom. The memory rose, sudden and uninvited. The day his father died, Esther didn't cry in front of anyone. She simply packed away the shared photos, rearranged the bookshelf, and moved in with Lucas. At first, he tried. He installed a private elevator in the house, hired full-time nurses, built a small library that matched the one she had loved. Everything was perfect, on paper. But 2 years in, when she started forgetting the housekeeper's name, mistaking Lucas's assistant for an old high school friend, he panicked. Not because she was ill, but because he didn't know how to be present in the face of her change, her slow, irreversible fading. He began traveling more, working later, rearranging meetings to avoid the hours when she was most lucid. And one afternoon, when he found her lost in the garden, clutching a student's map project and calling his name like it belonged to a boy in one of her old classrooms, he made a decision. He didn't ask her, he just implemented the best possible solution. A private nursing home, Riverview, with resort-level care, specialists, quiet grounds. A place where, he told himself, she'll be safe, dignified, and well looked after. But he hadn't chosen it for her. He had chosen it for his own peace of mind. Lucas stood still, remembering that. Then he opened the bottom drawer of the wooden cabinet, the one where he kept things rarely used. Inside was an old envelope. No stamp, no address, just a folded piece of paper. A letter from his mother. Inside, in her familiar slanted handwriting, "Don't bring flowers. I'd rather hold your hand, because flowers wilt. But your hand, even in silence, lets me know I've never been forgotten. No title, no explanation, just her quiet voice reaching across years." Lucas sat down on the floor. The paper rested between his palms like a fracture never quite healed. He remembered a night, long ago, when classmates mocked him for misspelling a word. His mother didn't scold. She simply sat beside him and read him a poem. Every line she wrote wasn't meant for books or praise, but to cradle a child hiding inside his own need to be perfect. As an adult, he built his career on biotechnology, helping others preserve memory. But not once had he tried to preserve hers, the woman who had built entire worlds with nothing more than memory and ink. He looked again at her poem. Then, on a blank page nearby, he picked up a pen and wrote, "Sometimes a poem is everything we forgot to remember." And in that one line he began to understand. His mother had never wanted a perfect nursing home. She had only ever needed a small room, and a hand that didn't let go on Sundays. Sunday came, as it always did, but this time Lucas brought no bouquet. He didn't wear a suit, his sleeves were rolled, his tie left behind. The Lexus still carried him to the nursing home right on time, but when he stepped inside, his eyes no longer searched for the nearest clock. Instead, they fixed ahead, on the hallway that led to his mother's room. Each footstep echoed softly along the marble floor, carrying something new for the first time in 3 years. Slowness. There was no mental itinerary, no countdown, just arrival. When Lucas opened the door to room 212, Esther was already seated in her chair by the window, like always. The soft light filtered through the sheer curtain, touching the silver in her hair, framing her with something delicate like the dust of the old memory. she didn't turn. Her gaze lingered on the garden. The breeze stirred the curtain, and with it, something in Lucas's chest. Something he thought had long since hardened. "Mom," he said quietly. No reply, but she tilted her head slightly, enough to say she'd heard him. He stepped in, pulled a chair closer. This time, he didn't talk about work, didn't mention the latest biotech conference or funding round. He said nothing at all. Her eyes stayed on the garden, where the first hydrangeas had begun to bloom. The same flowers she once planted behind their old house, flowers that needed soft sun, moist soil, and a great deal of patience. "Do you remember the hydrangeas in our garden?" he asked, barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loud might break the stillness they'd finally found. She nodded slowly, still not looking at him. Her hands rested gently in her lap, fingers laced together. Lucas glanced at them. Thin, veined, the skin translucent. The same hands that once scribbled verses he secretly read as a boy. That once gripped his tightly while crossing a busy street. That once wiped sweat from her brow after long hours in a sweltering classroom. He reached out, without reason, without warning, and let his hand rest over hers. She froze for just a moment. Then, slowly, she turned, and for the first time in months, maybe longer, her eyes met his. Without confusion, without hesitation. That was all. She said nothing. She simply placed her other hand atop his and held it there. Lucas didn't move. In that instant, everything else vanished. There was no nursing home, no room 212, just a mother and her son, and something they hadn't shared in 3 long years. A touch. The breeze outside stirred again. The flowers nodded softly, as if listening to something unspoken inside the room. "Mom," Lucas whispered, his voice catching in his throat. She didn't answer, but she squeezed his hand gently. "Are you mad at me?" Silence. Then, so quietly it might have been mistaken for breath, "I don't need an apology. I need a hand to hold." Lucas bowed his head. No tears came, but something broke open inside him, wide and unguarded. He realized, for 3 years, he'd given her the best he could, but not what she needed most. He'd tried to be the perfect son, but forgot how to be her son. No word could replace the comfort of a hand held when we are at our most fragile. Lucas squeezed back. For the first time, just like she used to when he was afraid of the dark, and for the first time, Esther didn't look away. She closed her eyes, her head leaning softly against the chair's edge, like someone finally letting go of a burden carried too long. Lucas sat beside her, unmoving. No rush, no clock. His hand still held hers, and for the first time, neither of them felt forgotten. Sunday morning arrived at Riverview Nursing Home in its usual hush, golden light spilling across the glass corridors. The early sun filtered through the hydrangea branches in the garden, casting shifting shadows on the tiled floor like fragments of memory waking from sleep. Lucas Bellamy entered the lobby, no bouquet in hand, no phone, no polished presence. Just a white shirt, sleeves casually rolled, and a worn brown paper bag. Inside it was a drawing, crayoned, creased, and hidden for decades in a drawer even he had nearly forgotten. He had made it in 3rd grade on his mother's birthday. That paper bag had followed him through 3 moves, through college, adulthood, success, through becoming a millionaire. But never once had he opened it. He stepped into room 212. Esther sat by the window, as always. A light blanket covered her knees. The air was gently scented with peppermint tea, Mila's careful Sunday ritual. She didn't turn her head, but her voice floated toward him, soft as breath. "Is that you?" Lucas nodded, then remembered. "Yes, Mom. It's me." He sat across from her and reached into the bag, pulling out the drawing, wrapped in layers of old newspaper. His hands shook, not from nerves, but from uncertainty. Would she remember? The picture was simple. 2 figures in a garden, one tall with long hair and a book in hand, the other a small boy holding a bouquet nearly twice his size. In the corner, scribbled in crooked letters, "Happy Mom Day. Lucas, age 8. Esther turned when she heard the rustle of paper. Her eyes, distant just moments before, sharpened into focus, like fog parting in a single breath. "Oh my," she whispered, her hand covering her mouth, then trembling toward the page. Lucas said nothing. He laid the drawing gently on the table between them. "I found it in a pile of old books," he said quietly. "Do you remember it?" She didn't answer right away. Her fingers brushed the drawing, soft, slow, as if touching something alive. Her eyes never left it. Then she smiled, not politely, not faintly. She smiled fully, an unguarded, sunlit smile Lucas hadn't seen in years. "You gave me gorilla arms," she chuckled, hoarse but clear. "Look at those hands." Lucas laughed. "I didn't know how to draw hands. I figured your arms had to be long enough to hug the whole world." She looked up at him, the smile still stretching across her time-worn face. But her eyes, those eyes were bright again, as if they were catching the very light outside the window. "I remember that day," she said. "You hid the drawing under my pillow and said, 'Look at it when you're sad.'" She blinked, slowly. "I looked at it that night, and I cried." Lucas looked at her, silent. He hadn't expected that of all the things he had given her in his life, this was what she had held on to. Not the grand gestures, not the awards, the houses, the care plans, but this. "I thought you'd forgotten," he said, his voice catching. Esther shook her head, her gaze drifting toward the garden. "There are things I forget, but the moments that made me feel loved, those I always remember." Outside the door, Mila stood in silence, holding a tea tray. She didn't enter, just stood still, hands wrapped around the tray where, for the first time, there were 2 cups, one for Esther, one for Lucas. She placed the tray quietly beside the door and turned away. She didn't need to be there. The moment belonged to them. A mother and son, a forgotten drawing, a smile returning like spring after a long winter. Lucas looked from his mother to the faded crayon lines on the table. "That smile," he murmured. "How many years has it been gone?" No one answered, but the smile was there. And sometimes the answer doesn't need to be spoken, because it's already present, right here, right now. Since the day he brought in the crayon drawing from 3rd grade, Lucas began returning to Riverview with something unfamiliar: intention. He no longer came on schedule. Sometimes he arrived at 8 in the morning, other times in the late afternoon. He no longer brought flowers or gifts. There were no polished greetings, no need to perform the role of a model son. He came simply as a son who needed his mother, not out of duty, but because something quiet and vital had begun to stir inside him. One afternoon, just after lunch while Esther was asleep beneath her light blanket, Lucas turned to Mila. "Do you know if my mother ever left behind anything?" he asked. "Letters, poems, something she wrote?" Mila didn't look surprised. Maybe she'd been waiting for this question. "There's a drawer in her bedside table," she said. "She never lets anyone touch it." Lucas nodded. "I'd like to." He opened the drawer. A breath of old paper rose to meet him. A scent he hadn't realized he missed. The scent of years, folded and stored carefully away. Inside were a few black and white photographs, a small leather-bound notebook, and a bundle of papers tied with a faded burgundy ribbon. The ribbon was worn. The edges of the pages were softly yellowed. His fingers trembled as he lifted it out. One sheet slipped loose from the bundle. Handwritten, slanted script. The ink had smudged in places, but the words were clear. "Don't bring flowers. I'd rather hold your hand, because flowers wilt. But your hand, even in silence, lets me know I've never been forgotten." Lucas sat down on the edge of the bed. He didn't let go of the paper. The poem, her whisper the other day, the line he had searched for online without finding its author, was here. It was hers, written for him. At the bottom of the page, in a tiny slant, Lucas's birthday. Age, 8. "To my son, the first poem I ever wrote for just one person." The room fell silent. No hum of the ceiling fan, no warmth of sun on the curtain, just the memory of being 8 years old, sitting in the corner of a room while his mother bent over her desk, writing. He hadn't known what she was holding then. He pressed the paper to his chest. For the first time in his life, he understood what it meant for a poem not to be read or recited or published, but to be kept, as a way of holding someone close. That afternoon, Lucas didn't leave. He sat by her side, the poem in hand, rereading it, not aloud but through his eyes, letting the lines move through him. When Esther woke, she saw him sitting there. Her eyes lit up. Lucas held out the poem. No words. She read it over, her lips trembling. "You found it?" she asked. He nodded, smiling. "I forgot it once," he said. "The whole poem. The feeling, too." He took her hand. "But maybe it never really left. Maybe I just didn't have the courage to look back." She squeezed his hand. A single tear fell, neither of them sure whose it was. Maybe it belonged to both. That evening, back at home, Lucas opened his office bookshelf. He pulled out the leather notebook he used to take to scientific conferences, flipped past pages of data, projections, careful notes, and began a new chapter. He wrote at the top of the page, "The poem Mom wrote when I was 8 is something I've spent my whole life needing to read again." His pen paused at the page's edge. He looked around the room, his room for the first time, and felt it wasn't empty. Some memories don't disappear. They just wait for the moment we're brave enough to return to them. Morning at Riverview was nothing out of the ordinary. The flower beds had been evenly watered, the hallways polished to a shine, and soft classical music drifted through the common room. But for Lucas, something had shifted. Not around him, but within. He arrived earlier than he ever had on a Sunday. Not because he had somewhere to be after and not to prove anything. He had simply woken early, watched the light filtering through his bedroom curtains, and felt hollow. No flowers. No coffee. No need to prepare. He pulled on a soft cardigan, one his mother had given him for Christmas the year he turned 35. He'd never worn it before, dismissing it as not CEO material, but this morning he wore it. His pocket held no phone, only a small, folded sheet of paper, his mother's poem, written when he was 8. He carried it like a charm, not to show, not to recite, but as a quiet reminder. Some things, when written in love, outlast memory itself. When he opened the "Doctor to room 212," morning light spilled across the small balcony. Esther was already out there, slight and still, her back straight, her hands resting on the wooden armrest. Her gaze was turned to the hydrangeas in the garden. Lucas knew without asking. She had been sitting there long before visiting hours began. He walked over, said nothing, didn't call out. Just pulled the second chair beside hers and sat. The distance between them, less than the length of an arm, had taken him 3 years to cross. He looked at her. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes shimmered in the sun. He saw time drawn across her forehead, her knuckles, the curve of her spine. He saw, too, the way she didn't turn immediately to him, as though she had grown used to watching the horizon, hoping he would someday arrive behind her. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. A soft breeze stirred, brushing a few leaves across the patio. The scent of peppermint tea lingered, his mother's favorite. Lucas suddenly remembered. When he was a boy, whenever he was sad, she would make tea. No hugs, no explanations, just quiet, a sip and stillness. He hadn't understood it then. Now, here he was, doing the same, sitting beside her, saying nothing, asking nothing, just being there. He looked at his hands resting on his lap, hands that had shaken 1,000 hands in business deals, jotted down numbers in meetings, clapped shoulders in congratulations. But not once had they been still long enough for someone to lean on. Esther blinked slowly, then turned. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She leaned in, very gently, and rested her head on his shoulder. Lucas froze, not in surprise, but in recognition. There was something deeply familiar about this, something long buried, just now returning. He didn't move, didn't breathe too loud. He simply shifted his posture so his shoulder could carry her weight. She didn't say a word, but her breathing deepened, like someone finally exhaling after years of holding something in. Down the hall, Mila stepped out of the common room. She happened to glance toward the patio and saw them, 2 silhouettes side by side in the gold of early sun. She didn't approach, didn't need to. She paused for a few seconds, then jotted a note in her little notebook. Today, for the first time, he stayed, without trying to be anything at all. She closed the notebook and walked on. She knew she wouldn't need to bring tea at 9:30. Today. Time passed, but for Lucas, it felt like time had stopped. He didn't check the clock, didn't care for texts or emails. His hands stayed still, his shoulders steady, his heart rooted in a single, unfamiliar feeling: presence. As the sun shifted and the dappled light began to pull back from the patio floor, he remained. In his mind, only one thought held. For the first time, I stayed, without trying to become anyone. Some moments of staying don't need promises, or presents, or reasons. Sometimes all they ask is that we have the courage to sit down and be there. Do you remember the last time you stayed fully with someone? That morning, the sky was more clouded than usual. The light wasn't bright, but warm, gentle and even, spreading across room 212 like a soft velvet veil. The air felt neither cold nor warm, only still enough to make someone want to stay. A little longer. Lucas sat at the edge of the bed, an old notebook in hand, the one where he had carefully rewritten his mother's poem from when he was 8. The cover was worn, the pages yellowing, but the words were etched with quiet care. Not to archive, to relive. "Do you remember the leaf that could speak?" Lucas asked, flipping to the first page. "You used to read it to me every night." Esther sat upright in her chair, a blanket tucked gently around her waist. She didn't answer right away. Her eyes were distant. Lucas went on without waiting. "I remember a line. The leaf falls, the boy picks it up and says, 'The leaf told me not to run too fast, or I'll miss what matters most.'" For a moment, Esther frowned faintly, then slowly whispered, "Exactly, line for line." And the boy's mother said, "Leaves. Don't talk, sweetheart. You just learned how to listen." Lucas stilled, then smiled. "You remember," he said softly. Esther nodded slowly. Her eyes cleared, like the clouds above were pulling aside to let the sun in. "You were in 3rd grade. You struggled with reading, always swapping letters, but I made you read that book every night." Lucas chuckled. "I hated that book for a while. I thought you were trying to make me memorize it." "No." Her head shook gently. "I just wanted to keep the moment you misread 'listen' as 'listen,' and then blushed and laughed for 5 straight minutes." He blinked. "You remember that?" "I do," she said, voice weak but certain. "It was the first time I heard you laugh while reading. Before that, you only read to get it over with." Lucas tightened his fingers around the notebook. Another memory surfaced. Him, a boy hunched over the desk lamp's glow, struggling with words, while his mother sat across, a cup of tea in hand, listening to every syllable he stumbled through. Esther leaned toward the small side table, reaching for a thin children's book with a faded blue cover and flaking silver lettering. Mila had repaired the spine just months ago when it began to fall apart from age. She opened straight to the page. The leaf that could speak. Lucas took it from her, turned the pages slowly. "Read to me," she said, her voice touched by that soft, familiar sweetness that used to wrap around his childhood bedtime. Lucas looked up, blinking. Then, like slipping through time, he began, his voice unpolished, unsure, tender. Not the voice of a man who led boardrooms, but of a boy again, trying his best not to misread. One autumn morning, the first leaf fell. The boy picked it up, pressed it into his notebook, and listened to something very quiet. His voice dipped. The air grew still, thick with memory. A soft breeze swept through the balcony door, lifting the edge of her blanket. Esther closed her eyes, mouthing the words along with him. Lucas reached the end. The leaf could not speak, but the boy's heart, it knew how to keep what mattered. He stopped. They sat in silence. A moment later, she opened her eyes and said slowly, "We used to have a world, so small, just you and me." Lucas bowed his head, taking her hand. "I thought I'd left that world behind." She shook her head. "No, you just got lost, but you found your way back. In that simple room, no flowers, no soft music, no elegant gifts. Something more, enduring, lingered. Memory. Not memory told. Memory lived." Through a voice reading again, a breath shared, a gaze held, a hand not let go. and the strange, quiet truth was this. Sometimes it takes only a children's story to guide two people, lost for too long, back home to each other. The wind slipped gently through the balcony railings, rustling the hydrangea leaves with a whisper of sound. Inside room 212, everything had quieted after the reading of The Leaf That Could Speak. Esther had drifted off in her armchair, her lips still faintly moving, as though continuing the story in her dreams. Lucas sat by the window in the wooden chair. He didn't move. His eyes remained fixed on the garden, but he wasn't really seeing it. His mind replayed everything. Each word his mother had recited, each line of an old poem, each moment he'd heard the echo of his own childhood voice. Afternoon light had shifted. The room turned amber, like watercolor ink spilling into warm water. And in that light, Lucas saw himself, clearly, as if something inside him was slowly peeling away the armor he'd worn for years. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, head bowed, shoulders slack. Not from fatigue, but from a deeper kind of weariness, the kind that comes from having to be strong all the time, from always showing up as the gracious son, not the boy who once feared losing his mother so much he couldn't sleep without hearing the sound of her keys at the door. That fear came back now, unchanged, only sharper. With age, he remembered being 10, the time his mother left for a 3-day education conference. He hadn't eaten, hadn't spoken to the housekeeper. The first night, he lay awake with the bedroom door cracked open, just in case she came back in the middle of the night. If she comes back, I'll be the first to hear. He hadn't cried. He gripped his pillow and repeated in his mind, "Men don't cry. Men wait in silence." And he'd lived that way ever since, until now. No one touched him. No one gave him permission. But something deeper than words, something long hidden, cracked open quietly inside him. It didn't break with sound. There was no cinematic sob, no flood. Just one tear. It slid from the corner of his left eye down his cheek and paused at his jawline, just like him, hesitating, hoping no one would notice. Then another fell, and another, slowly, weighty. Lucas didn't lift his head. His hands hung loosely at his sides. He didn't know what to do with them. Wipe his face? Hide it? Or just let them be? He had never felt this bare. Not the man with a title, not the polished son, not the CEO. Just a boy, sitting beside a mother who had forgotten half their story, and crying for all the parts he had never dared mourn. The only sound in the room was the faint tick of the broken wall clock, the one he once told the staff not to fix. She doesn't track time anymore, and yet today it reminded him. Time passes, even when we don't name it. He raised his hand and wiped his cheek, not out of shame, but out of a quiet instinct. If she woke now, she might see something she once told him he didn't have to. Hide. A voice stirred from the past. His mother's when he was 12. You don't have to be strong all the time. But if you never learn to listen to yourself, when the time comes to be strong, you won't have a voice left to call with. Lucas looked up. His eyes were red, but for once he didn't look away. He stared into the window's reflection and saw himself, not composed, not pristine, but real. He stood, walked to his mother's side and knelt beside her. Gently, he placed a hand over hers. "Sleep well, Mom," he whispered. "I'm just a little tired today." His voice wasn't shaky, but something long lodged in his throat had finally loosened. At the end of the hall, Mila stood quietly. She had been there for a while. She didn't strain to hear, didn't try to look in, just stood, still, and understood. She opened her notebook and wrote, "Not everyone who cries is weak. Some only cry when they're strong enough to stop holding everything in." The afternoon deepened. No wind, no music, only a man sitting beside his mother and, for the first time, allowing himself to stay with what he felt. It was a windy Wednesday afternoon. Thick clouds gathered low on the horizon, signaling not just a shift in weather, but something quieter, deeper, turning in the heart of Lucas Bellamy. He didn't usually come midweek, but lately, after all, those Sundays spent coming and going like a man on schedule, he'd begun to make time for the unscheduled. Maybe, in some quiet way, he was trying to make up for every Sunday he left too early. He wheeled his mother out to the garden. Esther wore a charcoal gray knit shawl with a soft beige scarf Mila had wrapped around her neck. She looked like a sculpture shaped by time, no longer fragile, just slowed. The breeze stirred the garden, the scent of damp earth mixed with hydrangeas in bloom. Darkened leaves drifted slowly to the gravel path, spinning gently as they fell. Lucas bent down and picked up a petal, placed it in his mother's open palm. "Do you remember what these are called?" he asked, voice soft as the breeze. Esther looked down at her hand, silent for a moment. Then, "Your father used to plant them behind the house." Lucas nodded. "He did. You'd snip a few stems, put them in that little glass jar on the table." She smiled faintly. A stronger gust swept across the garden. Lucas stopped near the old Bodhi tree and leaned down to fix her scarf. As he rose, "Jack?" she said. He froze. His hand was still on the edge of the scarf. His knees bent slightly, instinctively balancing against something inside him that suddenly felt too heavy. He didn't speak. Her eyes were on his, wide and warm, full of quiet trust. She looked at him the way someone would look at a love returned from long ago, as if the decades had rewound and she was once again 27, watching her husband step through the gate after work. "Jack?" she said again, softer now. Lucas pressed his lips together. His breath caught in his chest. He opened his mouth to correct her, to bring her back, but stopped, because there are moments when the truth serves no kindness. And there is no answer. That won't break your own heart more than hers. He moved around to the front of the wheelchair and crouched so their faces were close. Eye to eye. "It's me," he whispered, "but today you can call me whoever you need." She smiled, not quite at him, but through him, like someone looking for a memory just past his shoulder. Lucas studied her. The name Jack echoed in his mind like a bell from a distant chapel. His father, the man who taught him how to change a light bulb, who looped scarves around his wife's neck in cold weather, who once told Lucas, "Being on time is a form of love." Lucas stood slowly. He didn't push the wheelchair any further, just rested his hand on her shoulder. "I can't compete with memory," he said quietly, as if confessing it to the wind. A yellow leaf dropped at his feet. The wind picked up again, slipping cold fingers down the back of his shirt. Esther tilted her head up, her gaze softening on him. "Jack, why do you look so sad?" Lucas didn't answer. His vision blurred, but he didn't blink it away. He let it happen. Let it stay. Something inside him, something he thought had shattered long ago, was curling inward again, folding itself into a hollow that had no name. Because some pain can't be refused. It just cannot be answered. A few feet away, an elderly woman was being wheeled past by her granddaughter. The little girl paused when she saw Lucas. Her eyes lingered, not with curiosity but with a kind of quiet recognition, a child's understanding that the man before her was feeling something too big to explain, something only adults know how to carry. The wind stirred again, not strong enough to sweep away the name his mother had spoken, but just enough to remind him that from now on things would not be the same, and the name Lucas, however true, might not be one she remembers next time. After that fractured afternoon, after a name was spoken that wasn't his, Lucas didn't go home. He sat quietly in the long hallway, back resting against the white stone wall across from room 212. In front of him was a large pane of glass, clear, enough to see into his mother's room without stepping inside. Inside, Esther had already been brought back in, the wind having turned too sharp. Mila had wheeled her in, removed the scarf, tucked the blanket gently over her legs, and stayed. Nothing extraordinary, just another moment in another day. Except, Lucas had never truly seen it before. He watched Mila take Esther's hand. Not the way nurses often do to reassure or settle. No, this was different. It was slow, gentle, steady. It looked like healing, like Mila herself was being soothed by the hand of a woman she didn't come from, but had chosen to love as if she had. Lucas couldn't look away. Esther tilted her head slightly, eyes half closed. A soft smile curled on her lips, dreamlike, tender. It was the kind of smile Lucas hadn't seen in 3 years. Not when he brought the most extravagant bouquets, not even when he arranged for a quartet to play outside her window. He sat still, unblinking, unsure of what the weight in his chest meant. A flicker of jealousy, a stutter in his pulse, a quiet question. Why Mila? She wasn't his mother's daughter. She hadn't grown up in that house with the old books, hadn't been taught how to spell using verses, hadn't once been scolded for scribbling Esther in crayon on the kitchen wall. Lucas folded his arms over his knees, lowered his head. His heart beat quietly, as if someone had knocked against the walls of his memory. Yes, Mila wasn't tied by blood, but maybe that's why she could be there. Maybe, unburdened by expectations or the performance of being a good child, or a successful son, she was simply allowed to stay. Lucas thought of all the times he had shown up, on time, by the book, but had already been glancing at the door before he even sat down. All the things he had given her. Expensive, thoughtful, impressive, but never once asking what she wanted beyond the visiting hours. And there was Mila, the nurse who had lost her own mother to Alzheimer's, who knew Esther liked her peppermint, tea just faintly steeped, preferred 6-8-syllable rhymes to sonnets, and most of all, needed a hand warm enough to hold when her world began to dissolve. Lucas lifted his head and looked into the room. Mila hadn't moved. Her hand still clasped Esther's. She didn't speak. She didn't shift. She was simply there. And Esther, even in her blurred mind, held Mila's hand tightly. She didn't call her the wrong name. She didn't mistake her for someone else. She didn't need to say anything at all, because the heart, especially an aging one, knows exactly who stays. Lucas turned his gaze away. His eyes burned, not with grief, but with the truth he had long avoided. Love doesn't always follow bloodlines. Mila wasn't his mother's daughter, but she had been there, precisely when Esther needed someone. Lucas stood, walked toward the door. He didn't go in. He simply stood close enough to let something inside him unclench, to let himself begin to learn what he had never been taught, that love does not require lineage. It only asks that someone show up at the right time. Room 212 was quiet. Esther had fallen into a deep sleep after a morning in the garden. Mila had gone back to the nurse's station to rest. Lucas remained alone. No music, no incoming calls, only the wind threading through the window panes, and a silence he didn't want to disturb. He looked around the room, now as familiar to him as his own office. But today, something stirred inside him. A quiet nudge. He walked toward the small desk where his mother used to jot in her journal or read the morning paper. The drawer stuck slightly when he pulled it. Inside, a few notebooks, scraps of paper, and a small ivory letter, unsealed, unaddressed, no name, no envelope. Lucas picked it up. The slant of the handwriting told him instantly. It was hers. The paper was yellowed and folded, but the crease was still sharp, still careful. He opened it slowly, as if afraid to tear something that had already held itself together far too long. Lucas, my son. Today is Friday. You said you were in Boston for a meeting, but I wonder if maybe you forgot. It's okay. You have such a big world now. I only have this little room. I saw you on TV. Your speech was wonderful. I didn't understand it all, but I think you're helping people remember, while I keep forgetting. Lucas stopped. His heart clenched around the space between words. The next line read, I wanted to write more, but there's one thing I still don't know how to ask gently. Are you still my Lucas? That was it. No closing, no signature, no love, Mom. Just that single question, suspended in air between uncertainty and hope, between mother and son. Lucas laid the letter on the desk, his eyes locked on that line. Are you still my Lucas? A question so soft it struck him like thunder, because he understood she wasn't angry, not bitter, not even disappointed. She was simply unsure. Unsure if the boy who once sat beside her to read, who once let her trim his fingernails while he slept, was still somewhere inside the man who showed up with perfect posture and pre-written phrases. Lucas pulled out the chair, sat down, placed both hands on the desk, bowed his head, not to hide tears but as if bending to something truer than pride. He had gone so far, so fast. His mother no longer felt sure she had the right to call him hers. His fingers trembled against the edge of the paper. Part of him wanted to fold it away, protect it. But another part, the tender, raw part that had finally learned to stay, wanted to leave it open, to let it rest there like a mirror. Not a mirror that reflected faces, but one that showed the rupture between love and presence. He whispered, I'm sorry. You wrote half a letter, and I missed a whole life trying to answer. The wind stirred. Again. The letter's page lifted gently, just a flutter, as if it, too, was breathing out the unfinished sentence his mother had never dared to complete. An unsent letter. A question never answered. And a son, sitting in silence, realizing. Sometimes the deepest pain isn't being forgotten, It's being remembered, but never named out loud. A letter left unfinished can undo the heart. The warm yellow light glowed gently in the corner of room 212. It was the first night Lucas stayed past visiting hours. Esther was asleep, her hand resting lightly on the side of the bed, lips moving faintly, as if still reciting a poem in her dreams. Lucas remained. He sat with the unfinished letter in his hand, a sheet of paper so thin, yet heavy enough to press down on his chest since the moment he found it. He read the last line again. "Are you still my Lucas?" That question had begun to echo inside him, steady and insistent, knocking against all the memories he had long told himself were dealt with. He stood. He didn't know why, but his feet carried him down the long hallway to the dim light of the staff room, where Mila's shift light still glowed behind a cracked door. He knocked. She opened it. One look at his face and she didn't ask, "What's wrong?" Just stepped aside. Lucas entered. He didn't sit, didn't look around, just stood there, hands tightening slightly. "Mila." His voice was low, rough. "You've been with my mother for 3 years?" She nodded. 3 years and 2 months this week. Lucas held the letter, not offering it, just holding it like proof of something unseen. "What do you think my mother thinks of me?" Mila didn't answer right away. She studied him for a long time. Without pity, without judgment, just presence. "You want the truth?" she asked softly. Lucas nodded, but his eyes didn't meet hers. He was staring through himself, as if afraid that meeting her gaze might cause something in him to fall apart. Mila stepped forward, not reaching for the letter, just resting her hand gently on the back of a nearby chair. "Some days," she says, "you're the best son she ever had. Some days, she says your name 3 times, and then stops. Some nights I've seen her write Lucas on a napkin and hide it under her pillow." Lucas sniffled. The letter in his hand wrinkled slightly where his fingers clenched. "And once," Mila paused. "Once she just said, 'My son isn't who he used to be, but I still wait for him every Sunday.'" Silence fell like dust. The hallway light flickered once, then settled. Lucas turned his face away as if afraid of what had just risen in him. "I don't know who I am to her anymore." "You're not the son she once knew," Mila said gently, "but you're still the one she waits for." Lucas froze. No accusation, no comfort, just a truth, soft, unflinching, that landed in the center of his being, where he had always believed, if I play the role well enough, love will follow. "I tried to succeed," he said. His voice cracked. "Tried to be on time. Tried not to give her more to worry about. I thought that was enough." "Enough for the world," Mila replied, "but never quite enough for a mother." He leaned back against the wall. The light fell across half his face, half in shadow, half in glow, just like what he was feeling inside. There were times I told myself I was doing everything for her, but really, it was so I wouldn't feel guilty. Mila didn't answer. She poured a glass of water, set it on the table. Lucas stared at it, then asked, almost too quietly, "Did you ever resent me?" Mila shook her head. "No, I pitied you." "Why?" "Because you had a mother who still waited, but you never quite learned how to sit down and stay for a whole morning." Lucas looked down. No defense, no denial. He unfolded the letter and, for the first time, handed it to her. "Read it. Then maybe you'll understand why." It took me this long to ask." Mila read it slowly. When she finished, she didn't speak. She simply laid the page on the table, smoothing the crumpled edge with care. "There are some questions," she said, "that don't need answers. Only the courage not to avoid them." Lucas gave a small, uneven laugh. It sounded like something had cracked. "Finally. So, what do I do now?" Mila looked at him. "The next time she wakes," she said, "don't come as the perfect son. Come as the real one." Lucas turned his gaze toward his mother's room at the end of the hall, where a soft lamp glowed behind the door. He no longer knew exactly who he was in her mind, but for the first time, he was ready to let her redefine it, not through memories, but through presence. Sunday morning. The air at Riverview felt still, not because anything unusual had happened, but because everything was simply quiet. The sky wore a pale layer of fog, softening the familiar corners of the garden and the halls, as if the world itself had decided to slow down. Lucas didn't check the time. He didn't need to know. All he knew was that today he wasn't rushing. No plan, no control. He stepped into room 212. No sound of shoes, no buzz of his phone, no polite greetings. Esther sat in her armchair by the window, a blanket draped over her legs. Her eyes were open, but not focused, like she no longer needed something to see, now that her mind was tired from chasing what it could no longer catch. Lucas pulled a chair beside her. Not too close, not too far, just near enough that their breaths could mingle in the morning air drifting in through the cracked window. He didn't ask, "How are you feeling today?" He didn't report, "Here's what's new." He said nothing. He simply sat. His hand rested, open, on his knee, bare. He didn't know if she remembered that this hand had once trembled after a bad grade in 4th grade, had bled from scraped pavement, had written letters to her from college, but her hand was still there, the one that used to steady him when the river of memory still ran full and strong. Esther didn't look at him directly, but her gaze paused. 1 second, then another, and then it stayed. Lucas didn't wait anymore. He reached out, not as an offering, but as a returning. Her hand moved, not from reflex, not like a nurse's habit, but like a mother's muscle memory, reaching, knowing. Their hands met. No chill, no tremble. Just the texture of time, like earth after rain, like an old book still fragrant with the dust of days. Lucas squeezed gently, not expecting her to, and squeezed back, but she did. It was small, but it was enough. Enough to know. She knew, not his name, not the day, but who he was. He looked at her, not for signs of the woman she used to be, not for the teacher's clarity or the sharpness of yesterday. Just this woman, right now, with thinner hair, shorter recall, but love, still whole. He bowed his head and whispered, "I'm here now, Mom." Silence. She closed her eyes. A soft smile curved her lips. Not the kind you give when you recognize someone, but the kind you give when you can finally breathe. A breeze slipped through the window, tugging her shawl over Lucas's shoulder. He didn't move it. He just sat still, letting her warmth rest where it had always belonged. Esther opened her eyes again. Slowly, she turned to him, her lips parted, her voice thin, like it came from someplace far away. "Don't bring flowers." Lucas froze. eyes wide. His heart tightened at the sound of a memory he thought had long gone quiet. He whispered, "I know now, Mom." But she wasn't finished. "I'd rather hold your hand." Lucas closed his eyes, and this time, when he squeezed her hand, it wasn't from pain. It was from a heart returned to where it had always belonged, not to prove anything, not to earn anything, just to be there, in the only moment that mattered. He didn't need flowers, or words, or anything else. Because today, for the first time, the act of holding her hand wasn't just a gesture, it was a reunion, a homecoming, a language that required no translation, because it was spoken beyond memory. Not a special day. Not a grand event, just a Sunday, just a hand, just a whisper. "Don't bring flowers. I'd rather hold your hand." And everything Lucas had forgotten was reminded to him again, not through words, but through the gentlest of grips. 7:12 a.m. No alarm, no assistant's reminder, no CEO schedule. Lucas woke slowly in a rented room near the nursing home, a room with a window facing the jacaranda trees, now nearly bare. No luxury bedding, just a single bed with thread-worn sheets. And yet, for the first time in years, he didn't feel like anything was missing. He made himself a cup of jasmine tea. No coffee, no hurry. Then, with a blank notebook in hand, thick paper, dark leather cover already softened with age, he walked to Riverview. On the way, he didn't check his inbox, didn't think about Lab 4. In his mind, only silence. Room 212, as always, welcomed the morning with a slightly opened window. The air smelled of peppermint tea and soft wind. Esther was seated, thinner than the week before. Her eyes looked out at the garden, waiting for something unnamed, perhaps imagined. Lucas didn't speak, didn't kiss her cheek, didn't ask if she felt okay. He just sat beside her, not politely, not out of habit, just as a son sits beside his mother. He opened the notebook and began to write. Today is Sunday, but there's no schedule, no quick visit, no quick goodbye, just this. He wrote down stories his mother once told him, stories he never bothered to record. How she skipped school one day to take him to his first live orchestra. How she once hid one of Dad's love letters inside a 6th grade math book. How, she used to say, happiness doesn't come from getting it right. It comes from showing up. With every line, his hand trembled. Not from emotion, but from the strange effort of allowing himself to feel something he'd spent years pushing aside. Each page was not a record, but a recovery. A piece of memory picked up, dusted off, and placed somewhere safe, where no one could take it from him again. Esther closed her eyes. Her thin hand brushed the armrest. Lucas paused, set his pen down, rested his hand over hers. No longer with hesitation. No longer with the silent hope that she'd recognize him. No longer needing her to say anything. Just a hand holding another. No reason, no ceremony, no need to explain. And then she opened her eyes, looked at him. Not clearly, not fully, but for a brief moment. Her gaze didn't drift. Lucas smiled and kept writing. Mom once told me, when I drew badly as a child, I'd get mad at the world. But she'd laugh, not because the drawings were ugly, but because I hid my tears. Maybe that's why I grew up never crying, never stopping. Until today. Time passed slowly, but it wasn't heavy. He wrote through the morning, without pause. At noon, Mila brought in a small bowl of rice porridge. He accepted it, no pleasantries, just ate, and kept writing. By afternoon, the light shifted amber. The garden dulled into something story-like. Lucas looked up. His mother was asleep, peacefully, as if she'd never fought a losing battle with her own memory. He turned to the final page of the notebook and wrote, "I used to write to repair other people's minds. Today, I write to repair my own heart." He set the pen down, folded the notebook closed. His hands trembled again, but not from exhaustion, from lightness. For years, he had lived to create memory solutions. Today, for the first time, he had written to remember his own, not for anyone else. Not to prove anything, just for her and for him. Some Sundays we race, we build, we fix, we plan, all to escape the feeling of emptiness. But some Sundays, like this one, when we finally sit down, with no intention at all, that's when what we truly need shows up. Have you ever lived a day without a schedule? If yes, write it down. If not, maybe today is that day. And if you found a part of yourself in Lucas's journey, don't forget to subscribe to keep following these quiet days of healing. We tell stories to remind one another presence is never late. Some mornings don't need alarms, no appointments, no waiting responsibilities. And yet, somehow, we wake. We get up. We move because something gentle stirs in the chest, like a soft knock from within. That morning, Lucas rose early. Not because he remembered something, not because sleep had failed him, but because there was a quiet space in him. Still, uncrowded. As soon as his eyes opened, he remembered the scent of tea. Not black, not mint, the kind they brewed at the care home, but orange blossom. The kind his mother used to steep at the start of spring. In a ceramic jar tied with twine, resting on the low wooden shelf beside their kitchen stove. He remembered the color, light gold, the way it stayed clear in the cup, but caught the light like filtered sunshine. His mother used to say, "Orange blossom tea isn't for waking up the mind. It's for brightening the heart." That morning, Lucas walked into the staff kitchen at Riverview. He didn't ask permission, didn't need help, he just knew. His mother liked orange blossom tea. His hands weren't used to choosing kettles or measuring leaves. But that morning, they moved slowly, as if his fingertips remembered something his mind had been too busy to hear. He found the jar, low in the back of the cupboard, opened it, and the scent rose. Soft, not sweet, not sharp, just enough to press into a part of him that no one had touched in years. He boiled the water, let it cool slightly, rinsed the pot, steeped the leaves. Every step was quiet. Measured not in minutes, but in breath. Lucas carried the tray into room 212. Morning light filled the space. Nothing had changed. Esther sat in her usual chair, the blanket across her knees, sunlight spilling through the slats in soft, golden lines, like dreams remembered only by the body. She hadn't fully woken, her eyes half lost in sleep, her head tilted slightly, as if listening for wind. Lucas didn't call her name, didn't wake her. He simply sat, poured the tea, set the cup gently on the table. Steam rose, curled into the morning sun, then vanished. When the scent met the air, Esther's brow furrowed faintly. Then, slowly, she opened her eyes. She didn't speak, but her eyes moved, and she inhaled, carefully. Lucas lifted the cup, held it closer to her. She didn't take it. She didn't have to. She leaned in, breathed again, deeper. And then she smiled, not broadly, not clearly, but just enough, like a breeze of memory slipping through a long-shut window. And Lucas, holding that cup, felt his fingers tighten around something suddenly fragile. Like he'd just caught a thread of something he hadn't realized was about to float away. He didn't speak. Didn't need to. Neither did she, because in that moment, they didn't need language. The tea had done something no bouquet ever had. No gift, no music, no carefully planned visit. It had awakened something small, but right, inside her frayed memory. Not a name, not a date, not even a face. But herself, the woman who once brewed orange blossom tea, who waited for the kettle to whistle once, never twice, who loved a little boy bee pouring quiet warmth into Sunday mornings. Lucas held her hand, watched her eyes settle, and felt the ache of every year he'd spent trying to be remembered soften, because now he understood. There are things that do not need remembering to still be real, like a scent, a cup of tea, a hand resting in another. They sat like that, without counting time. The tea was sipped slowly, not hot, not cold, just warm enough to carry the faint bitterness of dried peel and the soft finish of blossoms left to bloom. And in that morning, Lucas no longer felt like a visitor, no longer a good son, no longer a man fulfilling duty. He was just someone who had made the right tea, for the woman who taught him how to listen without words. Nothing more, nothing less. Love, it turns out, can be that simple. Just remembering what kind of tea the other person loves. That morning, after Esther sipped her first mouthful of tea, the flavor of orange still lingered on her lips. Her eyes closed softly, as if she were listening to a song only she could hear. Lucas sat beside her. He didn't speak. He had learned, finally, how to stay inside silence without interrupting it. Learned how to let a day unfold like a stream, without crashing into rocks, without rushing ahead of the wind. He held the second cup of tea, untouched, no glance at his phone. No glance, at the time, only at her hands. They were thinner now, bones pressing close to the surface, but the shape of her grip remained, the 3 fingers curled slightly in, the index finger arching just so, the hand of a woman who had once held chalk, written on blackboards, graded in red ink for 30 years. After a while, Esther's lips moved. Lucas leaned in. She didn't call his name, didn't ask him anything, just murmured something. A rhythm, soft and small, and he recognized it. Poetry. Not the kind he'd published, not scientific, but the kind she used to teach him before he knew how to string letters together. He pulled a scrap of paper from his notebook, uncapped his pen. He didn't correct her, didn't search for meaning. He simply wrote, exactly as she spoke, where she paused, where she stumbled, where her voice drifted. Sometimes she lost the rhyme. Sometimes she stopped mid-line. He never fixed it. This wasn't a lesson, it was a passing down. Every syllable was a thread, sewing back together the scattered corners of his memory. Each soft meter tapping gently on the part of him that once knew how to write, just to remember, not to explain, not to impress, not to publish, just to keep. At one point she murmured, "Don't nap late today. You still have yesterday's assignment," then chuckled, tugging her blanket, as if she were still in a classroom somewhere long ago. Lucas paused, looked at her. He didn't know if she was speaking to him now, or to a second-grade version of himself from decades earlier. But it didn't matter, because in that moment, he didn't see a fading woman. He saw his mother, the mountain of his childhood, the woman who taught him right from wrong with couplets, who wielded tenderness like discipline, and discipline like love. The paper filled up. He turned to a new page, and kept writing. The scent of orange blossom lingered in the air, and in that morning light, there was no curriculum, no classroom, no students, just a son, writing down each word his mother spoke, as if he were relearning how to live. He'd once studied to be great, but now he was learning how to be good. When she stopped speaking, Lucas looked up. She was staring into the distance. He didn't know if she was watching the sunlight or remembering something only she could see. He whispered, not needing her to answer, "You're still teaching me, not with textbooks, not with rules, but with her fragile, persistent presence. A mother, even in her forgetting, still using her final threads of memory to anchor her son to something deeper. Not how to live to succeed, but how to live so that, even in weakness, you remain kind." Lucas closed the notebook, rested his hand on her shoulder. No one at Riverview saw it, no one needed to, but that morning, a lesson was written. Not on a blackboard, but into the palm of his hand. And Lucas knew, for the first time in years, he was a student again. Learning from his first teacher, the one who had taught him with words, with poems, and now, with her, quiet being. Even as she faded, she was still showing him, one more time, how to be human. The next morning, Lucas returned to the care home early. No rush, no bright eagerness, just the steady presence of a man who had finally begun to move again, in the rhythm of his own life, after years of following someone else's clock. In his hands wasn't just the familiar cup of orange blossom tea, but a stack of papers, filled now with his mother's whispered poems, with broken bits of conversations caught between the drift of memory and the pull of forgetting. He wasn't writing like a scientist looking for patterns, not like an author preparing a manuscript. He was gathering, like a son beneath a tree, slowly realizing that his mother had been planting quiet seeds into his life all along. He pulled out a new notebook. Its craft paper cover was plain, warm brown, unmarked, untitled. On the first page, he carefully glued a small photo. His mother as a young woman, standing before a chalkboard, chalk in one hand, gaze set just beyond the frame. He'd found it while sorting through old books once, a photo he hadn't looked at twice. But now, it felt like a cover, not for a scientific paper, but for something far more sacred. A book of memory. He began to write, not typing, not editing, no backspace. Just ink blue. His handwriting still bore the sharp edges of boardroom briefings, but it was softening line by line. He wrote down the story his mother had told him about being 15, tutoring the mute boy next door. The old bicycle she rode 12 kilometers each day to teach, just so she wouldn't be late. The day she read her first poem aloud in class, hands trembling, eyes steady. Each sentence, each recollection, rose up like watercolor from a brush dipped in warm memory. He didn't write to praise her, not to frame her for admiration. He wrote to keep her, to keep this woman, not just his mother, but a woman who had lived wholly, fiercely, and quietly. On the next page, Lucas sketched their old kitchen, the corner where Jack used to sit, rolling tobacco. The stool his mother stood on to reached the top shelf, the plastic sandals she wore year-round. He wasn't an artist. The drawings weren't beautiful, but they were true. And for the first time in his life, Lucas wasn't writing to prove anything, not to outdo, not to perfect, but to remember, to recover. Everything he'd once overlooked, the ordinary scenes, the half-sentences, the soft hum of his childhood, were returning to him. Not as nostalgia, but as wholeness. He didn't know where this notebook would end up, whether anyone else would read it, but he knew this. Each word was stitching him back into a story he hadn't realized he'd left. Not a story of golden memories, not loud joy, but the quiet story of a boy raised by a woman who was always the main character. He just hadn't written her name in yet. At noon, the sunlight slid across the little table by her bed. She was still asleep. The tea still warm. Lucas still writing, and in that scene, silent but not sad, still but not cold, a man was slowly, carefully writing himself back into the childhood he'd forgotten to hold on to, by hand, by heart, by grace. For the first time, his mother was the main character in his story. Lucas began leaving the little notebook by her bedside. He didn't tuck it away anymore, didn't carry it home, didn't protect it like a project. He left it there, open to a new page each morning. Sometimes he wrote a fragment of a poem she once recited. Sometimes a story without a middle or end. Sometimes just a line. This morning, she preferred her tea a little weaker. There was no goal, no structure, no title, just a small date at the top of each page. A quiet reminder. Today, too, is a day I still have my mother. Every morning when Esther woke, she'd glance first at the window, as always. But now, she began looking down at the table. Her hands, slower now, still found the edge of the notebook. She would open it softly. She never read aloud, never sounded it out, just looked long and still, then closed her eyes again. As if the words, once hers, were now a kind of morning prayer. Lucas came each day, without reminders. No alarms. No agenda. He'd rest his hand on her shoulder, wait for her to stir, then pour the tea. Then he'd sit and write. She still breathes lightly today. She didn't say a word, but smiled when I talked about her bicycle. Drew her old wool scarf. She used to knit these for winter. Or simply, "I'm home, Mom." One morning, Colder than most, Lucas arrived early. The tea wasn't hot, yet. The notebook lay open on yesterday's page. He had just placed his pen to a new one when she moved. Her hand. Slow, but certain. She reached, not aimlessly, but with purpose. She touched the edge of the paper, then the pen. Lucas pulled back. He didn't speak, didn't help. He barely breathed, just watched. Her fingers held the pen with 3 trembling fingers, wobbling, but steady. She wrote. Each letter, like climbing a hill, each stroke pushing through the fog of forgetting. Lucas didn't move. Didn't dare. When she finished, she set the pen down. 1 line. No punctuation. No flourish. He leaned over. Read it. Vroi. I'm home. Just 3 words. And yet, they widened the entire room, stilled the air like a whispered prayer. Lucas didn't cry. He only blinked slowly, as if to press the moment into permanence. His heart beat faster, not from surprise, but from the sheer weight of being seen, not by name, not by date, but by essence. He was known, not for who he had become, but for simply being her son. She didn't write again after that, just smiled. Gently, then closed her eyes. Her hand remained resting on the edge of the notebook. His hand stayed over hers. From that day forward, every time Lucas finished a page, he stopped signing it. Instead, he'd write, "Written with Mom," her son, finding his way home. No one else at Riverview knew. Mila never asked. She only refilled the tea, changed the linens, and left enough space for the quiet to breathe. And in that notebook, now grown thick with edges softened by use, there wasn't just writing. There was breath, a shared rhythm. Of a mother gently slipping away, and a son slowly returning to himself through every warm stroke of ink. She may not remember his name, but now, she knew he had come back, and that was enough. Lucas didn't leave the care home that day. Even as the last light of afternoon slipped behind the line of trees, he stayed, seated in the wooden chair beside his mother's bed, her hand still in his, like a habit newly formed yet already the only one that mattered. No lights on. The room softened into dusk. The final hues of evening pulled gently through the curtains, leaving behind a warm gray glow, like the old knitted blanket she always used, the one that smelled faintly of lavender, and home. No one spoke. Esther slept. She didn't shift. Her breath was thin, but steady. Lucas sat beside her, awake, but not thinking. His head leaned toward her hand, his forehead resting just near her wrist, the way he used to lean into her chest as a child when he didn't know how to admit he was afraid of the dark. He couldn't remember the last time he'd stayed up beside her through the night. Maybe it was when he was 7, burning with fever, and she kept her hand on his forehead, not doing anything, not saying anything, just holding. Now it was his turn, to hold, to stay. He didn't know if it helped, but he couldn't not do it. Night wind slipped through the window cracks. Not cold, but enough to make him feel that her hand had cooled. He adjusted. Her blanket, reached for a soft shawl, laid it over her shoulders, his hand never letting go of hers. That hand, veined like a river map of time. still shaped like the hand that once tapped a chalkboard, knocked on his window to wake him up every Sunday morning. The night moved like a river without sound. Lucas didn't check the clock, but he could feel morning approaching. That moment just before dawn, when the sky forgets what color it wants to be. Around 4, Esther exhaled softly. No gasp, no wait, just a breath. Released. Lucas felt it. Not panic, not shock, just a quiet rupture in his chest, as if something inside him, old, familiar, had just slipped away on tiptoes. He leaned in, listened, hoping for one more breath, one twitch of the lips, one small return. But none came. Everything paused. That breath was the last. Lucas didn't cry, but his body folded inward, as if the world had become slightly too large. He held her hand, still warm. Not for long. He lowered his head, kissed the back of that wrinkled hand, closed his eyes. His lips trembled, then whispered, "Mom, I'm here." No answer, but he didn't need one. Because for the first time, he didn't need her to respond. Didn't need her to say his name. Didn't need anything at all. Her silence was her benediction. Her leaving was her way of saying, "My son, you made it home in time." He straightened, took a long, steady breath, as if by keeping his own lungs full he could hold on to a trace of hers. His eyes welled, but the tears didn't fall. Not from restraint, but because the tears themselves hadn't finished forming. These were not tears of grief, but of release, the kind that come when a child has been quietly, wordlessly forgiven. Mila entered. She froze at the door for a moment, then stepped inside. No questions, no commentary. Lucas looked up. His eyes were red, but not empty. He reached for the notebook, opened it to the last page and wrote, "She's gone. But I came home in time." He closed the book, placed it gently on her chest. Let his hand rest on hers. Moment longer, then let go. Lightly, just as she had. No cries echoed down the hallway, no desperate wails, no one shouting, "Mom!" across the sterile white corridors. Just a sun, still warm, still present. Sitting still as the first breath of morning slipped into the room. Not all departures leave us hollow. Some leave us whole. 3 days after Esther passed, the weather remained the same, gentle like the morning she left. No rain, no sharp sun, only a soft wind that moved steadily through the air, as if the sky itself was holding its breath so as not to disturb a woman who had just quietly stepped out of the world. There was no grand funeral, no towering wreaths, no televised tribute or public obituary, just 3 people. Lucas, Mila, and an old colleague of Esther's, her final teaching partner before she retired. They gathered in the garden behind Riverview, beneath the willow tree where Esther used to sit and read. There were no speeches, no ceremonial language. No one spoke more than 3 sentences. But in the hush that followed, everything that mattered came forth. Afterward, when the last guest departed, Lucas remained on the bench. Mila stood nearby, not invading the silence, not walking away either. She stood the way she always had. Quiet. Present. Lucas turned to her, hands trembling slightly as he handed her a folded envelope. "My mother wrote this for you," he said. 2 weeks before she passed. Mila took it, but didn't open it right away. Her fingers gently pressed the edges, as if reading too fast might blur the ink. Lucas added softly, she asked a nurse to help her write most of it. But the signature, that was hers. Mila sat down beside him, opened the letter. The paper was thin. The ink blue. The handwriting leaned slightly, unsteady but measured, the kind of script written by someone who had lived her life by words. "Dear Mila, I don't remember everything, but I remember you, not with my head, but with the part of my heart that still knows how to stay. Some nights I woke confused, not knowing who held my hand, but if it was your hand, gentle, steady, never pushing, then I knew I was safe." Mila drew in a breath. Slow, measured, her eyes welled, but her grip on the letter stayed firm. Lucas didn't interrupt. He looked out at the willow's branches, swaying just slightly. "I had a son, a good one, though distant once, and then I had you. Not my child by blood, but someone who was never absent. If I could choose a daughter, I wouldn't choose anyone but you." That final line, it opened something in Mila. Not a wound, but a door she didn't know she had closed, not because love was missing, but because for 3 years she had never once imagined herself worthy of being called daughter. "I did not give birth to you, but if I had the choice, I would choose you all over again." Mila folded the letter slowly. She didn't wipe her tears. She turned to Lucas, unsure what to say, but she didn't need to. Lucas nodded, barely, but deeply. "You were there for her," he said, "in the days I wasn't brave enough to be. Now, your family. No title needed, no legal word. Just 2 people quietly acknowledging each other in the absence of the one who had made them family without ever needing to explain how." Above them, a gray cloud drifted apart. A soft shaft of sunlight broke through, falling, directly on the wooden table between them, lighting the letter, as if the sky wanted to read it too. Neither of them said another word, but in that silence, Mila knew Esther was gone. But she had left behind something Mila had never had before. A place to call home. A woman who had chosen her, not out of duty, not out of tradition, but out of love. And for the first time in Lucas's life, he didn't feel alone. Because beside him sat someone who had loved his mother the way he had always longed to be loved. That afternoon, after the quiet farewell and the letter still damp with tears, Lucas didn't go home, and Mila didn't leave. They stayed. On the wooden bench beneath the willow, where Esther used to sit every Sunday morning waiting for a son, who arrived on time, with flowers, with formality, but never long enough to stay. Now, there were 2 people sitting, Lucas and Mila. No words, no touch, but the silence between them was no longer distance. It was the kind of quiet 2 people share after they've both met grief and come back changed, not to fill the space, but to hold it. In Lucas's hands was a notebook, not a scientific logbook. No timelines, no charts, just a small weathered journal, filled now, page by page, with the slow returning of a son to his mother. The final page bore her writing. Today, he opened the first. He didn't read aloud at first, just trace the ink with his fingers, like retracing the shape of memory. The breeze carried a leaf across his shoulder. The garden, quiet, like a concert hall waiting for the final note of a piano to fade. Then Lucas spoke, or maybe whispered, but it was his real voice, unguarded, unscripted, undone. "Don't bring flowers. I'd rather hold your hand." Mila bowed her head, her eyes misted, but her smile curled gently. That line, once a wound, now a benediction, was no longer an apology. It was presence. Lucas closed the book, placed it between them on the bench, then turned to her. His eyes not wet, but full. "I used to come here to fulfill a duty," he said. "Now I stay to listen to love." Mila didn't answer, but she turned toward him. In her gaze, acknowledgement, gratitude, and something just shy of a beginning, the kind that doesn't need to be named. The light of sunset reached their shoulders. On that bench, once warmed by a mother, sat two people, not bound by blood, not defined by title, but joined by a kind of love that never needed a label. The wind passed through the garden. A single leaf fell, landing softly on the notebook. No one moved, no one brushed it away. Because maybe that leaf was Esther, sitting with them now, in another form, but with the same quiet tenderness she had always given. No grand ending, no swelling music, just two people and a bench that was no longer empty. Some journeys end with tears, but others are completed by simply choosing to stay. And in the golden hush of that afternoon, no one saw a son straining to be right. They saw a man who had finally softened enough to be real. "I used to come to do my duty. Now I stay to hear love." Thank you for walking this healing path with Lucas and Mila. If you've ever seen yourself in them, as the child who brought flowers but never truly stayed, or the one who loved deeply from the margins of a family you weren't born into, then maybe you too have stayed. No vows, no promises, just presence. Long enough, true enough. Subscribe to stay close to stories that reach gently but deeply, and who knows, maybe the next one will be yours.